Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. This afternoon, a Singapore court stayed the execution of Nagaenthran a day before he was due to be hanged. Now, this is after Nagaenthran was confirmed to have tested positive for COVID-19. The court had convened to hear an appeal against the execution, but the judge did not rule on the appeal. Instead, he said that the stay of execution was until further notice. Now, Nagaenthran had been on death row for drug smuggling for the past 10 years now and had been slated to be executed tomorrow, but was granted a stay of execution. As he awaits the final verdict, his case has continued to attract international attention and calls to commute his death sentence. But will public pressure change Nagaenthran's fate? Our first guest on the show tonight is Kogala Anamalai. She's a community organizer with Transformative Justice Collective, which is a group seeking to reform the Singapore criminal justice system, starting with the abolition of the death penalty. Kogala, good evening. If you could put this case in context for us to begin with, I'm just wondering what this case represents in terms of the issues with the criminal justice system in Singapore.
Well, thank you, Melissa. I think the case points to many issues, one of which is, of course, that many of the people on death row in Singapore are people from very marginalized backgrounds, and they tend to be ethnic minorities from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and many people on death row in Singapore are also Malaysians from very poor backgrounds and from parts of rural Malaysia, for example. So that's one of the issues it points to, and I think another thing is also Singapore's so-called war on drugs and how damaging it is to many families and communities is another thing that this points to.
The government's kind of stubborn stance on communicating this tough and harsh approach and the devastation that it leads to, and the many kind of rights and due process and issues of dignity and human rights that are overlooked so as to maintain that stance. Like, how, for example, there is a presumption of trafficking, like in Nagaen's case and in many other cases, when one is just carrying, there is a presumption that they are trafficking, and there is often the burden of proof is reversed in drug trafficking cases in Singapore, where you have to prove that you didn't, rather than the prosecution having to prove that you did in fact commit an offense. And many such issues, including how, for example, you don't have immediate access to counsel as somebody who is an accused person at the point of arrest for all offenses, actually. But it stands out particularly when the penalty is so harsh and irreversible, like the death penalty, that a statement is taken without the presence of any legal counsel and can then be used to convict you and sentence you to death.
Kogala, if we can focus on one of the things that has struck many people is the claim about of Nagaenthran's intellectual disabilities. Why didn't the court take that into consideration, and how do we make sense of the stance of the Singapore criminal justice system, of the prosecutors, of the courts, in terms of international standards when it comes to executing, or killing rather, somebody with an intellectual disability?
Yeah, I think, okay, so this one's got a lot of people confounded, right? Because I think one of the things that helps to understand is that Singapore has a mandatory death penalty for drug trafficking offenses, and it was amended in 2012-2013 following the case of Yong Wei Kong, which was a landmark case, and he's also a young Malaysian who was about 18 or 19 at the time of the arrest. And his case and the many legal challenges that were brought by his team of lawyers at the time led to an informal moratorium on death penalty in Singapore for a couple of years, following which Singapore introduced two things that could then help the court to not give somebody a mandatory death penalty. And one is a certificate of cooperation, which means that somebody is able to provide substantive evidence, substantive assistance that leads to, say, the capture and prosecution of other people in a drug ring, right? And so substantive assistance to the Central Narcotics Bureau. And again, this is completely at the discretion of the AGC to grant. And the second provision after the certificate of cooperation is abnormality of mind. But the way that abnormality of mind is defined and used in the legislation is very incompatible with international conventions around intellectual disability. Like, again, this term, abnormality of mind, is not found in international law or conventions. And also, the other wording in the legislation is that it has to diminish the person's mental responsibility. Again, that's not a term that's used in medical literature or in international conventions, right? So what is mental responsibility? And so in Nagaen's case, the court has held that because he knows he did, they feel from his actions that he knows what he did because he strapped the drugs to his thigh and he crossed border and he had an explanation for what he was carrying. So they used those kinds of pieces of information that they collected from the police to say that he knew what he was doing. And so they're not taking into consideration international law on intellectual disability and what this means for convicting somebody as well as sentencing them to death. So I hope that clarifies. It's a different framework entirely, right? They're not using international law or medical literature in determining these things.
Well, thank you for clarifying that, Press, that you laid it out well. I'm just wondering, I mean, because of the nature of this case, it has attracted a lot of international attention. I mean, you've got legal experts, you've got Richard Branson wing, and you've got human rights groups and the the EU also weighing in on this. And I'm just wondering, all of these, the calls to commute his sentence, is that likely to influence in any way Nagaenthran's fate?
Well, the court is supposed to make its decision independent of kind of the public conversation. So what the hope is that all the public attention to the issue and the pressure that we're hoping to build, and we're continuing to campaign and fight as hard as we can for as long as Nagaen is alive. And what we are hoping it will do is invite the president to grant clemency to Nagaen, but the president can only act on the advice of the cabinet. So what we're hoping for at this stage is clemency, and through the court, that is a different route. And if the appeal that his lawyers have mounted works, and the appeal is on the basis of his mental status and that his mental state has deteriorated in the last few years, is the kind of case that his lawyers are hoping to build. So those are kind of two tracks and two different approaches that we're hoping together could have a positive result for Nagaen.
Right, so because it must be extraordinarily difficult to live your life waiting day to day for that letter to come to say that you're going to be killed. I mean, that alone is tremendous mental torture, I imagine. The question is, does Singaporean public feel that this is something they no longer want to be associated? This compassionless, law and order, authoritarian outlook that the country has had for so many decades?
Yes, I think there's definite shifts in public attention. I think as anti-death penalty activists, we've seen definitely a very clear shift in public response to the use of the death penalty, and in terms of compassion and care for people on death row over the last few years. People are far more critical. Recently, we had a music festival, where local musicians on stage called for the abolition of the death penalty and for Nagaen to be freed. That's unprecedented. We've recently had, also in support of Nagaen's case, 237 family members and loved ones of people on death row sign a statement calling for the abolition of the death penalty. Again, this is a group that we never hear from because of the, tremendous shame and stigma that surrounds drug trafficking and death row in Singapore. So we've definitely seen a lot of shifts. And today we put out a statement on behalf of healthcare workers and social sector workers, inviting them to sign a statement saying that, Nagaen, in support of Nagaen's freedom from the death penalty. And within 5 hours, we had over, 300 people sign, if I remember correctly. So wow. It's just an incredible response. It's not the kind of response you would have seen a few years ago. The death penalty has always been seen as quite a taboo topic, even for activists to touch on. And a lot of activists and advocacy groups have been reluctant to speak up on it, but that's shifting.
Right. Kogila, thank you so much for being on the show. Kogila Anamalaide from Transformative Justice Collective. Thank you for being on the show. We're going to take a quick break. Stay tuned to consider this.
Amanah di tangan kita. Adat, budaya dan semangat menjadi kesinambungan perpaduan tanah air yang tercinta. Berteraskan adab yang terpahat di jiwa dan raga. Marilah bersama kita membina negara Malaysia.
Untuk memastikan Malaysia ada ke depan dan maju.
Induknya adalah Melayu.
Balik kepada seperti orang yang membuat polisi.
Kalau itu yang dikehendaki, fine. Mungkin kita berbeza pandangan.
Tapi kita mempunyai kuasa yang boleh menentukan budaya di masa hadapan.
Polisi yang mesra wanita sudah tentu dia akan datang daripada pemimpin wanita.
Asrama Mahat Tahfiz Jawaban.
Bila sentuh soal berita, tiada masa untuk tunggu. Kepada anda kami bawakan fakta, susulan dan kupasan yang terkini. Tiada drama dan tiada pengulangan. Usah tunggu lama-lama. AWANI 7.45 lebih awal dari biasa.
Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. With me is Sharad Kutan. If you've just joined us on the show, we're discussing the stay of execution granted to Nagaenthran Damalingam, the Malaysian man with an intellectual disability currently on death row in Singapore. His case raises many questions about any criminal justice system which still uses the death penalty. Let's speak now to lawyer Yohendra Nagarajan. He's the director of Eliminating Deaths and Abuse in Custody Together, better known as EDICT. He's also the co-chairperson of the Bar Council Human Rights Committee. Yohendra, good evening. What stands out to you particularly about the case of Nagaenthran Damalingam?
Okay, basically, we are quite concerned that Singapore is actually considering to execute a person who is intellectually challenged or has a mental disability. It has been shown that he has an IQ of just 69, and for them to actually wanting to execute somebody with a mental disability, that is quite worrying, you know, especially when Singapore has signed the Convention on the Rights of Persons of Disability. So they should take into consideration the rights of a person with disability, and they should not actually execute such a person.
Is there, though, a larger question, regardless of his intellectual status, the question of the death penalty itself? Many Malaysians, some involved in crimes like murder, have been killed in the Singapore state. Yeah. All right. Okay. So we'll wait for.
We're trying to get Yohendran back on the line, but again, as pointed out by Sharad, I mean, this case has many different facets about it, particularly with the intellectual disability case. Yohendran is back on the line.
Yes.
Right.
Yes,
okay.
So, Yohendran, very quickly, the question is,
yes,
the death penalty itself. Does the Bar Council, for instance, take a position on the death penalty? We in Malaysia had a kind of a start in 2018 with the then Pakatan Harapan law minister, on eliminating the death penalty. Is that something that we should also be concerned about, regardless of the crime? Should we abolish the death penalty?
I mean, the Bar Council has taken a stand that, execution constitutes an extreme and physical mental torture on a person rendered helpless by government authorities. It's a cruel and inhumane and degrading treatment or punishment, taking away somebody's life. So the Bar Council has always taken a stand that we should abolish the death penalty, and Malaysia has actually taken the step in 2018 to call for a moratorium, and until today, 2018, until now, nobody has been executed in Malaysia. So that we feel should be the correct stance taken by any country, actually. Because
can I then come back very quickly to the Nagaenthran case, Yohendra? I just wanted to ask you, last year Singapore did not execute anyone, and I'm just wondering about what's your take on the timing of all this? The fact that, he was on death row for 10 years, and then suddenly there's people pointing out that this is happening during the time of Deepavali festivities, but also the fact that the appeal hearing has happened so soon after the stay of execution was granted. Do you make anything of the timing of it, or is it just purely coincidental?
I would think it's purely coincidental. Nobody actually wants such a thing to happen, especially in being Indian and happening during Deepavali time. That doesn't leave a good taste in the mouth. But I think the courts in Singapore were trying to rush the appeal. But however, today there's some reprieve as Nagaenthran has been declared to have COVID, and because of that, the court has granted a further stay. So when he's in a better condition, then they will hear his appeal later.
But there's a supreme irony in waiting for somebody to get better from a disease in order to perhaps, we can't prejudge this, but perhaps put him to death. Isn't that somewhat cruel and ironic?
That is true, actually, because already when you've already informed him that the execution is going to take place, and then suddenly and again he's with his diminished intellectual capacity. We don't know how is he taking all this information, how is he processing this information, that is we feel that it's really inhumane, that this be carried on, and we are hoping that the Singapore government would grant a clemency or pardon through the president, and hopefully the sentence will be commuted.
Yeah, Jürgen, we also had the situation where the Prime Minister of Malaysia, made a personal appeal.
Yes.
Do you think that looking at the recent past history, that the chances for Nagaenthran are good? Sorry, are good.
We are actually hopeful. ASEAN, we have this non-interference policy, but I think it's good that our Prime Minister, with the Keluarga Malaysia slogan, that he's come up and openly stated that he has appealed through the Prime Minister of His Excellency, the Prime Minister of Singapore, for clemency, as well as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dato' Saifuddin Abdullah, also has come up with a statement that Wisma Putra is trying all channels to actually request for a pardon on this matter.
Thank you so much, Yohendran, for joining us on the show.
Yes.
Sorry, yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for your time. Yohendran Nadarajan there from Edict. We're going to take another quick break, but stay with us on Consider This.
rambut rosak dibaiki dalam masa 1 minit.
Amanah di tangan kita. Adat, budaya dan semangat menjadi kesinambungan perpaduan tanah air yang tercinta. Berteraskan adab yang terpahat di jiwa dan raga. Marilah bersama kita membina negara Malaysia.
Untuk memastikan Malaysia ada ke depan dan maju.
Induknya adalah Melayu.
Balik kepada support system. This is
orang yang membuat
polisi.
Kalau itu yang dikehendaki, fine. Mungkin kita berbeza pandangan.
Tapi kita mempunyai kuasa yang boleh menentukan budaya di masa hadapan.
Polisi yang mesra wanita sudah tentu dia akan datang daripada pemimpin wanita.
Asrama Mahat Tahfiz Jaabal.
Bila sentuh soal berita, tiada masa untuk tunggu. Kepada anda kami bawakan fakta, susulan dan kupasan yang terkini. Tiada drama dan tiada pengulangan. Usah tunggu lama-lama. AWANI 745 lebih awal dari biasa.
Hi, thanks so much for staying. Sharad and I on Consider This. Joining us on the show now is Debbie Chew, Executive Coordinator of the Anti-Death Penalty Asia Network, ADPAN. Debbie, we're discussing the stay of execution that's been granted to Nagaenthran Jamalingam, the Malaysian man with the intellectual disability on Singapore's death row. I'm just wondering, in terms of this case, how similar is it, or how different is it to other cases involving drug offences and the death penalty?
Well, in some ways, it's very similar. We often hear a very similar story when it comes to drug trafficking cases, especially Malaysian on death row in Singapore, where they are usually mules. It's quite rare when we see them being prosecuted for large quantity of drugs. Most of the time, it's relatively small quantity, and there's always a lot of ambiguity in the case, in the sense that they raise concerns that they were approached by a gentleman while they were in outside of the country, and then they asked them to take a package to Singapore for varying costs. So that part is very consistent, very similar. I think I've seen easily half a dozen to a dozen cases that looks exactly the same. But what is very, very different this time around is there is intellectual disability involved. And when we look at the law reports itself or the case itself, it was repeatedly highlighted by several psychiatrists, which the government now is denying that has happened. And we see that there's a very clear trend or very consistent message from psychiatrists or psychologists that this person is intellectually challenged. And how it manifests is quite complex in some ways. There is not a straightforward that he doesn't understand what he's doing. He may understand the immediate action of what he's doing, but there's a difficulty in comprehending or understanding long-term decision-making. Like how we will understand if I do A, B, C, D will follow as a result of that, right? There's a difficulty in understanding that. So when we look at this globally, no country, there has been instances where people with intellectual or mental disabilities are placed on death row, but it's quite rare for a country to decide to go ahead with an execution. So for Singapore, for this case, it is one of the very first or very difficult or tricky case, I would say, that I could not fathom why the government want to go forward with it at this point.
Well, this is, you put your finger on the question of why states, it's not just Singapore, but many other states take a very harsh view of this, an uncompromising, compassionateless view, one that strips away context and motivation and just tries to, as it were, try the crime for what it is on some basic facts. do you think that especially in the context of the region, there's very little sympathy for a more humane or humanistic approach to the question of crime and deterrence and rehabilitation, that there is in some ways a belief that, this is the right thing who have committed a crime, regardless of the circumstance?
So I think it is a topic or an issue that is changing perspective. I think in the past, people were quite happy to go with this strong on crime kind of position, and penal punishment is always the go-to, which is why I think we still have the death penalty in our books. So does Singapore and a lot of other countries, and we also have this idea of caning, public caning, the use of very tough disciplinary action in school, so to speak. But I think now that people are kind of realizing that that is a bit of an outdated or outmoded idea. The world is not exactly as black and white as it is. We have seen some country like Portugal, for example, when they work on decriminalizing drugs, that changed the situation a lot. We look at even among our own Malaysians itself, we have parents who are disputing the use of cane in schools, thinking that that's not a good way to bring up children. So I think the society is kind of gradually accepting the idea that the old punitive punishment system alone is not enough, not adequate anymore. We need to kind of rethink the system. So I think along the vein of death penalty, the same is starting to creep in. And I think every time when we do have a case, there always has a specific catch to it, right? Like in this case, intellectual disability, and people kind of see that punitive punishment or the reasoning that we use to have punitive punishment doesn't really work. How do you deter someone who doesn't understand the circumstances, right? So all these things are coming into play, and I can see them slowly shifting, but it is definitely a very long journey, I think, for the full shift over. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad to hear public sentiment may be shifting, but again, as you know, and this is your work, that the campaign against the death penalty is a long-standing issue. I'm just wondering, have we seen concrete changes? Has anything concrete shifted since the advocacy work has began?
Well, personally, to me, the moment Barisan Nasional is willing to put the death penalty on the agenda and discuss it, even though discreetly during Prime Minister Najib's era, where they amended the Dangerous Drug Act, to me, that's a very big sign. Even though they never had a formal moratorium, they decided to have an informal moratorium, which we see the stop of execution of drug mules, drug traffickers under 39B for, I think, at least 6-7 years now, almost. To me, that's a bigger sign that we are realizing things are different, right? Because usually we'll hear maybe Pakatan Harapan and other parties, that's the one that's more progressive in their views. But to me, when Barisan Nasional MPs and ministers and lawmakers themselves realizing things are not quite right, things need to be changed, even though they may not openly express it, but concrete action are being put in place, I think to me that's, a good hope.
All right. Well, that's encouraging to hear. Dobby, thank you so much for your time. Dobby Q there from the Anti-Death Penalty Asia Network. And that wraps up this episode of Consider This. Before we leave you tonight, a reminder that you can get all the latest information on COVID-19 vaccines at astroawani.com, as well as the Astro Awani app. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.
You're watching Notepad. I'm your host Ibrahim Sani. We're taping this interview here at Permata Sapura, and later on in my discussion with ATNS CEO over at Four Seasons here at the KLCC Business District. ATNS has just announced that they are making a groundbreaking investment here in Malaysia with total investments of over 8.5 billion ringgit over the next few years. They also plan to create 5,000 high-impact, high-meaningful, high-tech jobs over the next few years. The groundbreaking ceremony is in witnessing of the Chief Minister of Kedah, the Minister of MITI, and also the Senior Minister. And we're going to have Maida as well, witnessing the groundbreaking ceremony. But it's all about what ATNS can bring to Malaysia, and more importantly, what can Malaysia learn from ATNS? This is a company that has been around for quite some time, and this is a company that is involved in a lot of high-tech design, manufacturing and printing of the circuit boards and substrates for semiconductors, and this is an industry that everybody is looking at right now. So this is my interview with ATNS CEO during the announcement that they just made at Four Seasons Hotel very recently just now. Here's my conversation with Mr. Andreas Gerstenmaier, CEO of ATNS.
Modules have become popular as they offer several advantages over single PCB solutions, such as the combination of one or more functions in a single package, high integration on compact form factor, improved performance, and cost effectiveness. Modules deliver miniaturization through optimized usage of space.